Hello, and welcome to another episode of It's a History Podcast. I am your host, Madison, and in the Halloween spirit, we are going to be looking at Memento Mori. If you've ever taken any kind of Intro to Humanities class, you may have heard of this before. If you have not heard of Memento Mori before, it is a Latin phrase that translates to remember you must die. But the term Memento Mori often refers to an object that acts as a reminder that death is inevitable. Objects that fall into this would be skeletons, skulls, hourglasses, flowers, and extinguished candles. With that said, this episode will contain many depictions of skeletons, corpses, and just general discussions of death, including the death of children. So let's get right into it. Memento Mori have been around for thousands of years, going back to ancient times, as they have always served as a reminder to people of the impermanence of life and what gives life its meaning. Looking at the ancient Romans, they would often reflect on their own mortality, even going so far as to present small skeletons to guests at a banquet or feast. These little skeletons were called banquet ghosts, and they would sometimes be articulated so guests could make the little skeletons dance around. In some feasts, instead of tiny skeletons, the dinnerware would have skeletons etched into the silver. The Science Museum has a copy of silver cups from Roman times with skeletons, and it is also engraved with the phrase, "enjoy yourself while you live," which is pretty much the ancient Greece version of YOLO. As we transition into medieval Europe, we get the Danse Macabre, or the Dance of Death. This is something that has been depicted in visual arts, drama, poetry, and even music since the late Middle Ages. This Dance of Death is depictions of skeletons or even decaying corpses dancing with the living and also leading them to their fate. Imagery of the Danse Macabre was a popular memento mori among the largely illiterate population. This was still the time before widespread availability of reading material, so imagery such as paintings or even sculptures were one of the main vessels in which the majority of the populace received information. Within the Danse Macabre, the living dancers were a wide collection of different types of people across different classes. There would be kings, knights, merchants, a painter, and even children to depict that death does not discriminate on age, profession, or title. Another popular memento mori of the medieval era was something called the Three Living and the Three Dead. This was both a visual and literary memento mori that showed a meeting between three living noblemen and three animated corpses, who were in three very different states of decay. The story shown depicts the three noblemen as showing disgust towards the corpses, but the corpses are quick to remind the noblemen that at one point in time they too looked like the noblemen. The corpses then warned the noblemen to improve their behavior before their time comes. A third motif that we will look at is a beggar, a witch, a king, and a beauty. This is a smaller motif that shows 4 skulls on each side of 2 crossbones. Each one is labeled, one is the king, one is the beauty, one is the witch, and one is the beggar. This simple motif shows how death is the great equalizer, how when looking at the skeleton you cannot tell who was who, and that they are essentially interchangeable. This design originated sometime in the 13th century, and it is theorized to be based on a design from a Greek urn that featured a skeleton and a poser by being asked if they could tell whether the living person has been beautiful or ugly. This motif would remain popular and would even be etched into 18th century snuff boxes. So imagery of death and acknowledging one's own mortality is all fine and well, but why were medieval Europeans really obsessed with it? Well, the medieval time period was a time period where there was just a lot of death, like more than normal death. Within the span of 2 centuries, Europe was struck by multiple famines, multiple bloody wars, and various plagues. One of those plagues being the Black Death, where 30 to 50% of Europe's entire population were killed. Medieval people were very aware of death and witnessed it intimately every day. Memento Mori were a way for them to come to terms with not only their own mortality, but also the mortality of their loved ones and neighbors. The medieval time period was also a super religious time period. Religion was a central part of living in medieval Europe, and it was thought that when presented with the inevitability of death and the indiscriminatory nature of death, that people would voluntarily choose to live holier lives. By living a holier life, people believed that they would be rewarded with eternal life rather than spending eternity in hell. Moving away from the medieval era and into the 17th and 18th centuries, memento mori started to change. It should be noted that within the context of the history of the time, Europe had gone through the Renaissance and art itself had changed. Techniques had improved and more people were literate than before. With that said, Memento Mori of the late 16th century started to get a bit more graphic and realistic. This time period saw the introduction of Memento Mori waxworks. Sculptors like Gaetano Zumbo created wax tableaux that very vividly depicted scenes of sickness and death. In his wax creations, he used graphic presentations of putrefaction. Putrefaction is the process of decay that a body goes through after death. It is the decomposing of organic material by various bacteria or even fungi that result in a combination of foul-smelling compounds and gases. Gaetano Zumbo had been inspired by the scholarship of scientist Francesco Redi. Francesco Redi had performed experiments of rotting meat to observe its decay and the meat's eventual infestation with maggots and flies. With this information, as well as observing actual corpses, Zumbo created some grotesque wax models of corpses in an advanced state of decay. The Science Museum has a wax model plague scene that was sculpted by Gregorius Lento in 1657, which is thought to depict the recent plague that had hit Naples in 1656. In the model, there is a slab near the rotting corpse that is inscripted in Latin to say, "It is my lot today, yours tomorrow." In the wax era of Memento Mori, sculptors also started to create anatomical waxes that were used by doctors of the day to study the human body. These wax figures gave not just doctors, but the public a look at what an anatomically correct human looked like under the skin. These figures would be in public spaces, in open medical theaters, or even in natural history museums. This era also brought wax vanitas, where sculptors would create a wax head with one half being a skull and the other half having a living face. Again, another depiction of the fragility of life and the inevitability of death. I think we've had enough of the wax. Let's move on into mourning jewelry, a more personal memento mori. This type of jewelry was created in the mourning of loved ones, oftentimes with the deceased individual's initials engraved into the jewelry piece. Having gained popularity in the 16th century, these items were small tokens that the living could carry with them or display on their person in memory of their loved ones. Some jewelry pieces would contain the deceased's hair. Hair does not decay the same way that human tissue does, so it would be able to be used in this jewelry and actually last, especially when cast into resin. Some hair would be woven into a sort of basket weave and serve as the background for depictions of skeletons and hourglasses. Brooches were a common form of memento mori jewelry, as well as rings and necklaces. Mourning rituals have changed quite a bit since this time period, with our modern practices having the body of a deceased loved one removed from the home rather quickly, or for one to pass in a hospital or a care facility. Up until the 19th century, it was quite common for the body to remain in the family home for up to 10 days, where the family would mourn, care for the body, and the hair would be combed and styled. Before the body was removed from the home, it would not be uncommon for a part of the hair to be cut to be made into memento jewelry later on. Originally something that was reserved for the rich and wealthy, mourning jewelry did eventually become something that was more accessible to the more middle-class population, especially after some women started to learn how to make the jewelry on their own, and even more so accessible as instruction manuals were made available. As the years went on, the symbolism of death did start to stray away from the pretty on-the-nose imagery of skeletons, and instead people started to lean towards less direct imagery and more into subtle depictions of death like gardens, flower arrangements, willow and cypress trees, and even graves or urns. As we entered into the age of photography, people started to have portraits taken of their recently deceased loved ones as a more permanent way to remember them. Photographers would set up the deceased individual's body in a way that was most natural looking, although there is still something definitely uncanny about the pictures. Sadly, the most popular form of death photography came from parents who had lost their children. Deceased children would be posed within parents' arms, laying down, or as if they were simply asleep. As we have become more disattached from death, and as it has become more sanitized and removed, the descriptions of memento mori may seem extreme or more grotesque than they need to be. But we must remember that the life we live today is vastly different than the lives of the average medieval human. We have access to healthy foods and clean drinking water, we have medicines and treatment for disease. We also have a more robust funeral system thanks to capitalism. Instead of caring for a deceased loved one's body in our own home, we call for the funeral home where they take the body away, possibly embalm the body, and prepare the body for viewing. And embalming is a very invasive part of preparing the body for viewing and burial. Embalming works as a way to preserve the body, especially when the body needs to travel large distances. Embalming fluid is made up of many chemicals, including formaldehyde and methanol. And not to get into the nitty-gritty details, they can definitely be found, but the embalming fluid essentially replaces the blood, acting as a full body preservative. What we see when we go to the viewing of a loved one is a highly doctored corpse that has been made up to be presentable to friends and family. In looking at Memento Mori, the discussion usually ends with death photography in the 19th century, but I do think we should acknowledge some of our own types of Memento Mori that you might not think of as Memento Mori. I would say that one that is extremely prevalent in our modern era would be roadside memorials. Some of the more simple roadside memorials are crosses that say drive safely. In just that one sentence, drivers passing by are immediately aware of the fact that not only had a crash occurred in this location, but it is likely that someone has also passed away due to the crash. And these roadside memorials are not regulated to just a cross. In my own commute, I drive past a bike that is painted white and positioned on the side of the road. There are no words, there are no pictures, but myself and fellow drivers are all aware that this is a roadside memorial. I would even venture to say that memorial tattoos and even the in memoriam stickers that some people put on their cars are modern day versions of Memento Mori. They all act as a way to remember the deceased, but they also serve as a reminder of our own mortality. I joked about it earlier, but YOLO, or you only live once, is a less descriptive remember you must die. And with that, I'm going to end today's episode. This episode has been on the darker side, a bit darker than I typically do here. So next week, look out for something that's a little bit more on the lighter side. Let me know if you have heard of Memento Mori before. Sources for today's episode include multiple articles from the Science Museum and Sherman's Flatbush Memorial Chapel and their entry on how embalming is done. Thank you again for listening to today's episode. If you liked what you heard, leave a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts and share with a friend. If you have any questions, comments, or topic ideas, please email me at itsahistorypodcast@gmail.com. Thank you again for listening to today's episode, and I hope to have you in the next one.